Aloha mai kākou, aloha ahiahi, menina mai. I'd like to welcome all of you this evening to this evening's presentation for Hawaiian History Month. And this one, as our Hawaiian History Months have been arranged to celebrate the birthdays of Queen Liliuokalani. We are celebrating the 184th birthday of the Queen. We are pointing to the general mission of Hawaiian History Month, I ka wā māmua, ka wā māhope, our history, the past, present, and the future. And tonight's session, which will focus on Hawaiian history and culture, kindergarten through 12 and beyond, across the curriculum, across the ʻāina. We are deeply grateful to the Hawaii Pono'i Coalition for supporting this and for bringing this group of people together. My name is Jonathan Osorio. I am very happy to be moderating this session of really amazing educators, and that's the common thread that holds us all together. Everyone who is present tonight are people who have had a powerful and in fact amazing effect on your children and many of you through public education here in Hawaii. So I'm going to begin by introducing the members of the panel to all of you. And again, before I go any further, I'm just going to say that we are going to have a conversation this evening about the significance of history and how we as educators bring a knowledge of history, an appreciation for what human beings have done in the past, a deep appreciation for this place, for Hawaii, and the way it has shaped and formed us, and how we bring that into the work that we do, which involves teaching not just history, but science, social sciences, humanities, literature, creativity. And so that's where the conversation is going to go. It's my job to get it started. And once I've gotten it started, I think it will take off and have an amazing life. Let me begin by introducing our panelists. And I'm going to introduce them sort of in the order they were presented to me, but we will be actually starting the conversation a little bit out of order. The first person I'd like to introduce is Whitney Aragaki. She is a science teacher at Waiakea High School in Hilo. She was the State Teacher of the Year in 2022 and a finalist as for the National Teacher of the Year award. This is what it says on the blurb that celebrates her amazing achievement and her work. Whitney Aragaki supports students to learn through a lens of abundance that honors place, people, and cultures. Her teaching focuses around conversations, practices, and systems that sustain the intimate interrelationship of public education, community, and environment. So I don't know if you can make her screen larger, host, but Whitney Aragaki is there, and she's right there. Everybody say hello to Whitney. The second person I'm going to introduce is Patricia Espiritu Halagao. I've known her for quite a number of years. She is professor and chair of curriculum studies in the College of Education and has been a member of the Board of Education for the state of Hawaii. This is what I discovered when I looked at a conversation that she was having with a number of teachers and educating and conducting a panel essentially on, here's the name of the panel, Perspectives for a Diverse Hawaii, Personal Practice and Policy, Compassion, Peace, Identity. She speaks of these things as being important parts of what we do as educators to bring people to an understanding of their identity through their values, through race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, gender, class, sexuality, and language. And in the conversations that she's had and the panels that she's participated in, she leads these kinds of conversations with people by getting them to discuss how they see themselves and through what kinds of lenses they understand their themselves in the world and in Hawaii. The next, can we have her? Do we have her? Okay. The next person is Cheryl Kauhane Lupenui. She is the president and CEO of Kohala Center and founder of the Leader Project. I had a chance to take a look at a conversation that she had with another educator in which she described education as an ecosystem, but not just that it's land-based or place-based, but that education always looks at interrelationships as ecosystems, as things that when you bring something into a conversation, when you bring something into an ecosystem, you don't just have the ecosystem and that thing, you actually create a new ecosystem. It's additive, it changes things. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind in this conversation. Christopher Pike is a 5th grade teacher at the Chiefus Kapi'olani Elementary School. He is also an award winner, 2022 State of Hawaii Presidential Awards for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching. When I went to the website and took a look at your work, one of the things that struck me is that it focused immediately, Chris, on this garden that you've created, you and students have created, and the way that you reached out to students to actually not just create this garden that includes kalo and other things, but also celebrate it through the artwork that young students were creating to celebrate that garden. And finally, Liz Soto. I've known Liz for many, many years. She's currently the communications officer at the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. But she was also an early organizer of Youth Speaks Hawaii and founder of Pacific Tongues. Liz Soto is a poet, and she is an inspirer of poets. She has taken young people, middle school age people, children basically, struggling to become adults, and shown them a way to be expressive, to be creative, to be analytical through poetry. And she'll be one of the panelists tonight that will bring the kind of depth that we really need to have a proper conversation on the place of history to us, all of us as educators. So now that I've introduced everyone, I'm going to try and get this started by turning to two contributors to a book. I'm going to hold this in front of all of you. This is The Value of Hawaiʻi 3. And I am one of the proud co-editors of this volume. Value of Hawaiʻi 3, Hulihia. This is a work that has a number of chapters, small articles presented by people, by many different authors, people who work for nonprofits, by educators, by artists, by farmers, by people in the community who are deeply rooted in Hawaii as a place, who see really important messages for the future, and who all basically, I think, agree that we are in an important place of transition, that the things that are happening around us are leading us to a different kind of future, they're shaping the way we behave as people, the institutions that we create, the institutions that we maintain. We are in the midst of great change. So I'm going to turn to two of the authors who submitted a co-written paper for this. Patricia Halagao and Cheryl Ka'uhane Lupenui. They wrote a chapter called Hawaii Breathes Multiculturalism. And I think that they are the perfect group of people to get us started on this conversation. I'm going to ask them to talk a little bit about what they wrote here and talk a little bit about their work and try and set the stage for the rest of us.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody so much for being here tonight on a Friday night. Cheryl and I thought we would just dive right into our chapter. And so, and I have our book right in front of us at our chapter. And so what we wanted to do is read just a quick excerpt at the beginning of our essay with the hope that you'll use our work as possibly a frame to think about how we can look at the connection between Hawaii history, Hawaiian history, and our multicultural histories that are all interconnected and intertwined. And so if you want to follow along with us, I think they just put a link into the chat about the book. And we're actually page 186 is where we start. So I'm just going to start with the beginning. 4 years after serving on the Hawaii State Board of Education, Patricia Espiritu Halagao and Cheryl Ka'uhane Lupenui engage in conversation about their work on linguistic and culturally sustaining policies. Lupenui was instrumental in establishing Nahupeno'a'o, HA, a new ends policy of learning outcomes grounded in Hawaiian values and culture for the educational system. Halagao's work on the seal of biliteracy and multilingualism for equitable education policies comes out of this context. Here in this chapter, we reflect on the past and imagine a future around the question, what is multilingualism in Hawaii? We bring in voices of language scholars to get to our own na'au, our gut, heart, and we invite you to join our search for conditions where multiculturalism and multilingualism thrive in Hawaii's past, present, and future. And so in our time that we have to introduce our chapter, Cheryl and I wanted to kind of mimic our talk story that we had in the chapter. And we share it in a talk story approach because we really had to have this conversation with each other to figure out the answer to this question. And so basically, you're going to see in this chapter snippets of pieces of our conversation. And so we're going to show this process right now in the time that we have. And so we're just going to ask each other questions.
Thanks, Patricia. So I love John's introduction of us, but I think that maybe in the context of our essay and why we're here, I'll ask the question, who are we? And maybe if you could just introduce yourself through that lens of multiculturalism, multilingualism.
Yeah, sure. So I speak a lot about identity in the courses that I teach. And so I just want to share in terms of who I am. I identify as an Asian settler in Hawaii, a Filipino, very conscientious of my Filipino identity, very proud of my Filipino identity. In fact, a lot of my work is around Filipino K-12 education, but I wasn't always proud of being Filipino. And so a lot of my work is about building cultural pride in all our students. And so that's a key part of who I am. And also being a teacher. I'm an elementary teacher. So a first grade former elementary teacher and now a professor at the College of Education. And now, Cheryl, who are you?
So I am from Hawaii in the sense that I feel deeply rooted to this place. I live here on Hawaii Island, and I feel I was raised by many people in places of Hawaii from Kaneohe to now Kohala. That being said, I was not born in Hawaii and I did not go to high school in Hawaii. So as a product of Hawaiian, Chinese, German, Italian, French, English ancestors and more, I bring a lot of different cultures and perspectives, it appears, from those ancestors and from this beautiful place called Hawaii. Mahalo.
So Cheryl, when you think about how we wrote our essay, and you reflect on the journey and the process of writing our essay and figuring out the question of what is multilingualism and multiculturalism in Hawaii, did you have any moments of insight or aha throughout our conversations?
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind, I think, in the context of our conversation tonight. And that's the fact that we've been talking about past, present, and future. And so when you and I started this journey, we didn't have a destination in mind. We didn't have a question even. We didn't even know where we were going, but we knew we were going to be on a path together. And I think that process of learning, of co-creating, of shared walk stories is really an important part of our educational ecosystem and how we go about. And also, I think from a Hawaiian perspective, looking to our past to understand the future is a really critical part. And so I appreciated that part of the journey. From a content perspective, I think what really resonates for me is that in that journey, I found my ancestors, I found my 3 times great grandparents, and I found my connection to the language of Hawaii, and that there was Pidgin Hawaiian before there was Pidgin English. Like, that makes sense to me now, but at the time that was pretty revelational, and it helped me understand the language of my grandparents. And so I really, appreciated that the aha moments weren't just at the big macro ecosystem level, but that they were very personal in this journey with you. And so what about you and your reflection? What were some of your aha moments?
Well, when I was first asked to write this chapter, actually, I was given a pretty broad assignment of writing about my connection on the Board of Ed or just the field of education. And at the time, I was really grappling with figuring out the relationship between multilingualism and Olelo Hawaii. You and I both were on the Board of Education, and you had, worked on the Naho Peno A'o policies. I had worked on the multilingualism policies, but I had this question in my mind in terms of what's the connection for all of this? And so, and I also was very, again, conscientious of honoring the space of Hawaii and learning from my colleagues, there's a difference between reclaiming your language, and then maintaining your language, those many that were our heritage language learners themselves. And so when I was thinking about this essay, I really wanted to figure that out. And so working with you has helped me figure out this relationship. I always knew that Hawaiian should be a foundation in the work that we do, but it didn't really dawn on me until we had a moment when I was thinking about how the Nahu Peno'a'o policies really opened up the space for us to even look at multilingualism and multiculturalism. And so that was an aha moment where I thought, wow, Hawaiian context, the fact that we're in a space of Hawaii that values multiplicity, that values multiple cultures, opened up the space for multilingualism. So in essence, Hawaiian context breathes multilingualism. And so, so in my mind, that was huge to see that relationship. And I've kind of carried that perspective in the work that we do, and then the teaching that we do.
Well, I'd love to, I have one last question left, and I would love to explore what you just said. And I feel like it's really important that, that we're looking at Hawaiian history, Hawaiian science, Hawaiian education is not just for Hawaiians. And I feel like that really resonates what you're saying. And you and I both put that into practice daily. And so maybe you could share a little bit about like how you've woven this learning into your practice of teaching.
Yeah, so in the university, I sit on a board called the HAP board, the Hawaii Asian Pacific board. And we're a board that looks at different syllabi at the university and how faculty weave in Hawaiian Asian Pacific history together. And I always remember how I was kind of taught in terms of how to look at a HAP course. And that would be like a big H, little a, little p. In other words, the Hawaii context is where we're at. So we always need to emerge of that as a foundation. And then you also have the multiple other multicultural cultures as well. But I can think of a very specific instance that you and I were trying to figure this out. When we were trying to figure out a curriculum or a lesson that I've always done on at the Hawaii Plantation Village, when we look at the notion of sugar. And I thought, in many ways, I would bring teachers to Hawaii Plantation Village, and we would look at, going through the different houses. If you've ever been to the Hawaii Plantation Village, looking at the different cultures at the Hawaii Plantation Village through the houses. And I wanted to bring a more critical aspect. So I would bring in labor history, the racism and the hierarchy in the Hawaii Plantation Village. And when we even visit the Hawaiian hale, and in terms of before we started the village. But it wasn't until you and I started planning and looking at my sugar unit through this lens of Hawaii breathes multiculturalism that we altered the way that we taught this particular curriculum. And we literally started to ground our lesson more in the place of Hawaii. And so I'm going to shoot it back to you on like, how do we then change this lesson to reflect this notion of Hawaii breathes multilingualism and multiculturalism?
Well, I was glad you brought up sugar and plantation, because that's exactly how I connected to my ancestors who are up here in North Kohala.
Oh no, we just lost her.
All right. I think.
Oh, wait, here she's coming back. She's in Kohala, so she's having some technical difficulties.
Really? Because
I know.
Hi, Cheryl.
I'm very missed here. Hi. So I'll try to get through this quickly so others, because I keep cutting out. But I think the point is that, I'm in a place where not only my ancestors, but our Kohala kids are here. And so we get to actually bring them to places to introduce them to the multiplicity of stories of Mo'olelo, so that they aren't limited to one story of sugar or plantation life, or any aspect of the ʻāina that surrounds them that they really aren't often introduced to, even though it's their backyard, it's their neighbors, it's where they live and work. Well, not work, but hopefully work. And so that's what we do here at Kohala Center is our curriculum.
So just to continue, we basically make sure that we're incorporating literally the place of Hawaii and ground ourselves in the place of Hawaii. And then, also bring in the connection to the multicultural histories in Hawaii. So that ultimately.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you both for getting us
well said.
To an important start here. I'm going to bring the others into the conversation now, and I'm going to turn to Whitney, and I'm going to ask you the same question that Cheryl and Patricia asked each other. To start with, who are you, and to describe, your identity in all of this, any way you wish to. And then once you've done that, if you would maybe address some of the things that they talked about, that this notion, and in fact, it was kind of interesting when you said Hawaii breathes multiculturalism. I thought you said breeds, which is actually, I think, also true. I want to turn to you, Whitney, and ask you to consider that as a way of talking about the work that you do. How do you see the importance of Hawaiian language, culture, land, familiarity with place, right? The fact that students come with their own expertise, right? About their neighborhoods, right? About the places that they hang out in, about the language that they use, especially when it's not just English. How do you use those things? So first describe yourself, and then maybe deal with that a little bit.
Okay. Aloha kako. My name is Whitney Aragaki. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Just listening to Patricia and Cheryl share, and to preface that, Patricia was my professor, so I'm used to sitting and listening and just yeah, I agree. And Cheryl was in session with us. Yep, that's how. But a little bit background on me. I am a Japanese settler, 5th generation, what I would consider gosei in Hawaii, on Hawaii Island. So for as long as I can trace back, I know my genealogy on this island. I know it very specifically to the ahupua that my family has settled on, and the intricacies of how we have as a Japanese community, we have been exploited by American capitalism, as well as recognizing our own settler history in Hawaii. Something that sits with me very deeply as a teacher in our Hawaii public schools is that, let's say, 2% of American educators are of Asian ancestry, some kind of Asian ancestry. However, in Hawaii, 25% of teachers identify as Japanese. That being said, only 9% of students identify as Japanese, yet 25% or more of our students identify as Hawaiian. And so this inequity and kind of this mirroring of the Japanese and Hawaiian experience is something that I walk into classroom with daily, and I recognize my privilege and I recognize my positionality and potentially the harm that my community has caused upon generations of students. So I have come from a family of educators. My mother was my own high school teacher. My auntie was my principal, and so forth. There's a long lineage of elementary teachers. Also, my auntie taught at the school that Topher in this room right now is teaching at right now. So many different things. And in that, when I came back to Hawaii and I said, I'm going to be a teacher, I think I'm ready to be a teacher, but I have to do this Master's of Science program just to fulfill a fellowship check mark. I took a class. I was already a certified teacher in Pennsylvania, because that's where I went to college, but I came back to Hawaii, to University of Hawaii at Hilo for my master's degree in science. And I took a class from Auntie Manu Meyer. And it was Introduction to Education of Ethnic Groups in Hawaii. So thinking about how Hawaii breeds multiculturalism. And Auntie Manu, the first day walking in, I've never taught a day in my life in Hawaii public schools. I've only been a student. She goes, "You're not ready for this class." And I was like, but I signed up for it and I got the approvals, I'm ready. And she's like, "No, you need to go back and you need to get some life experience first." I said, but it's a class, I can learn. And so she's like, "Maybe try come back next week and we'll see." So she sent me home with her book, Ho'olu, and it's like, okay, can do. And I came back the next week and I said, "Auntie Mananovas, I read the whole book. I'm good. I can sit in your class now. I'm ready." And she said, "That's the exact reason why you're not ready. Because you think you can read a book and you think you can understand, and that's not it. Reading a book is not going to teach you how to engage with your community." And I fought tooth and nail to stay in that class because although I went home crying that day, crying to my dad, and I don't know why I cannot be in this class, but also thinking, what do I need to do in order to understand my identity and definitely my privilege before I can teach students in Hawaii, before I can engage and see all students through this lens of abundance that I now have come to use and work with every single day. And so it took me the whole semester to kind of wear her down. Eventually, she became my thesis advisor for some other things, and she's still on my dissertation committee today. But that was an extremely important lesson to understand, that just because you read a book does not make you smart in any way, shape, or form. I know we're talking about a book today. I got smart through reading The Value of Hawaiʻi, I promise, John. But these things are something that I try to impart on my students every day. So I teach advanced placement classes. I teach the kids who think they're smarter than me every single day. And that is something that we work with. That what is your positionality? How do you recognize your cycles and circles of privilege? And how do you use your privilege to speak up for others? And now privilege does not only have to be ethnic in our community. It could be social class, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, and all these different things. But these spheres of influence, how do we teach our kids to use their voice to speak up and speak out against injustice and harm? In the same note, how do we encourage our students who have historically been excluded, who have been underserved? How do we encourage them now to use their voice and recognize that their stories have meaning and their stories have value? So this year, I've had the amazing opportunity to speak across the nation about my platform of place-based education, how place truly informs how students understand their identity and how they can contribute to their communities. In doing so, I push upon these three pillars. That place, or a sense of place, encourages us to understand where we are, and who we are together. These three pillars of identity have been underscored by the idea that Tai Tengan and Kyle Kachihiro wrote about in The Value of Hawaiʻi 3 with the strength of koa. And I take this message and I share it out pretty broadly across the nation now, that koa is teaching us where we are. It's a foundational tree in our Hawaiian ecosystem. It's a watershed tree on Hawaii Island. When I drive in nearly every ahupua, I can see koa. And that's something that really grounds me as to where I am. But koa is also who I am, or who we are, in the sense where koa was used by the Native Hawaiians in order to travel. It was their canoe source. It was their building source. It's the strongest tree in the forest. It teaches us their strength from our na'au. And then koa is also who we are together. So koa, and this taking from The Value of Hawaiʻi 3, and this is something that's so interesting to me, that a koa seedling cannot simply be planted. We cannot just take a koa seed and plant it and it'll grow into like the biggest tree in the forest. No, a koa seed must endure a scarification, some kind of cut, gash, that's some kind of trauma. And taking that metaphor of the trauma that students have experienced from this pandemic, which is what The Value of Hawaiʻi 3 kind of references, this pandemic experience. From that traumatic experience, we can grow and we can become the strongest trees in our forest as well. This lesson has been imparted upon me many times over, and this this book, this Value of Hawaiʻi book has been transformative to me in the past year. So when it first came out, I was in classes with Patricia, and I was also in class with Kamana Beamer. And so both of them, of course, right? They just wrote something, you're going to make your students read it. And so I did. I was like, okay, I'm reading these things. And eventually I was like, oh, I want to read the rest of the book. I think this is so interesting. And how easy to read a 1,200 word essay for a teacher, someone who has very limited time on my hand, to get academic connection, but also maybe I could share it with my students. So then I started thinking, well, I want to start the class year with the reading Wito Vai Vai. Like, what does that mean? And have students break down that metaphor of Vai Vai for themselves and to understand our place in environmental science and our place in learning. So all these things kind of came together, and I was talking to Patricia about it, and I was like, I think I want to create a professional development course for teachers about this free book that we can get into teachers' hands, and then we can get into students' hands. And within 2 months, I think I was able to petition the Hawaii Department of Education to accept this as a credit-bearing class for teachers. We got it off the ground with help from Craig Howes. We got it off the ground with help from John Osorio, and we offered the class over the summer. And I was so excited to see that Topher was one of the participants in the course. And I hope that he can speak a little bit more from a participant lens on that, what that looked like, and maybe how he infused those readings into his own classroom. But it was just amazing to see teachers come together and to have face-to-face conversations with the authors who wrote these stories, so that when we give it to students, we don't just give it as a secondhand thing. We're like, no, we actually talk to the authors. This is a very close reading, and we know the background behind the reading. We know the intricacies behind and between the lines. And that's something that I kind of want to elevate for teachers, to see that we can continue getting authors, getting academics very close to K-12 education. Mahalo.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And at some point, I'm going to want to step in and talk a little bit about some of the themes that are emerging that will engage us even more in conversation. But I'm going to do what I said I was going to do and go through each of you. I heard you say Topher, so I think you were talking about Christopher, right? I mean, this is really good. And so I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked before, and that has been raised already. Who are you, and how do you see yourself in all of this? I think that because now we're really moving through that door of the Value of Hawaiʻi 3. If you want to say a few words about how you've participated in this and in its value to you, that would be fine. But I'm also really interested in seeing whether your experiences are similar to Whitney's in terms of, sort of recognizing, and I don't know your background, so maybe if you tell me that you're a native Hawaiian, then I'll just simply say, okay, well, but if that's not the case, if you're coming at this from the standpoint of seeing yourself even at some point as being outside, and if you want to talk about that as well, I think it's an important part of this, because in my mind, Hawaii, this place, the community that exists here, actually does bring us into a relationship. All of us, those of us who have committed to this place, and certainly as teachers who have been recognized by the state as exemplary teachers, you have invested in this place. So yeah, tell us who you are and whatever else you want to say after that, Topher.
Okay. So my name is Topher Pike. Background about me, I grew up in upstate New York, and really the best way that I describe that to people is I went to school in a town with more cows than people. I came to Hawaii in 2014 as a part of Teach for America. And my placement school was Hononau Elementary on the west side of Hawaii Island. And I honestly have to start anything I begin with the debt that I owe to everyone in that community. I am who I am today because of them. Coming in as someone from, pure upstate New York, rarely having been traveling much outside of my community. I was sheltered in a lot of ways. I had a lot of ideas that I know now are not correct. I had and still have a lot of learning to do. And within that community in Hononau, I was able to grow and find very much a second family. And like many families, they pushed me, to both examine who I am, where I've came from, and the importance of the work that we do as educators. And through that, I was connected with many fantastic educators, including Whitney, who, I very much consider a role model and a mentor now. And so I had the opportunity to take this PD class with Whitney and to hear from these authors and to look through these stories. And I took the class my first year teaching at Chief S. Kapiolani. I moved over to the Hilo side. And one of the things that, I had instilled in me previously was this love of garden work and getting the kids outside and learning. And actually in the COVID years, when we were back in school, I had held about 50% of my class in the garden, whether we were just reading outside, doing science experiments, working with the plants, or really just, sitting out there, relaxing and talking story for a little bit. We spend a lot of time outside. And that was something that, I just knew was very powerful for the students. So looking through the chapters and hearing stories and being able to talk to some of the authors, one that really stood out to me was a essay called "Local Foods Through Crisis" by Hunter Heivolen, which talked about some of the issues of food security and insecurity in Hawaii. Especially targeting things like the amount of food that is imported versus the space and the resources that we have to produce food here. And so I brought this text to my students and opened it up as, first to kind of get them excited about it initially was, okay, we're going to be reading a story that college students read. And they're like, what? We're in 5th grade. And I'm like, yeah, you guys got this. And really what that kind of speaks to, and my goal in all of this, is for the students to recognize that they are the experts, especially when it comes to issues of place and issues of Hawaii, much, much more than I am or many other teachers could be. They are the experts in this. They have the lived experiences. They have some of the current experiences, especially growing up in this scenario, that I could never have, and I could never teach or be on the same line as. So, we started reading this article and the students were running the discussions. And I was very much just a resource, which is kind of my goal in the classroom. I'm not the sage on the stage, they called it. I'm not the one who's imparting the knowledge. They're sharing the knowledge with each other. They're talking about the things like, we were doing a food audit. And so we were talking about the things that we ate and where it came from. And the students were starting to develop that idea of like, okay, just because I made it in Hawaii doesn't mean that it was made here. So for example, when we first started, a kid said that last night he ate Kraft macaroni and cheese. And so the discussion was, well, is that a food from Hawaii? Well, yeah, I went to KTA, I bought it. I bought the milk there, I put it all together. I made it in Hawaii. And so the other students brought up is like, okay, well, where do we grow the stuff to make macaroni? And what kind of milk did you get? Did you get metal gold milk, or did you get that from somewhere else? Where did the butter come from? Where did the cheese sauce come from? And this was student generated. And so I'm kind of just sitting back, not saying too much, and really just in awe of the students taking this discussion. And so the discussion started working its way towards, well, how do we change that? How do we make that difference? What are the big things and what are the little things that we can do? Because it also became an issue of insecurity. You know, when we talked about, you know, where does the food come from? It comes in on barges, it comes in on planes. And, you know, coming especially right out of COVID time, you know, they had the question of, well, what if the barges stop? What are we going to do? And so that's where I kind of could jump in and share some of the other things that I had learned or I'd been taught about, you know, basic gardening skills, finding canoe plants, anything that was local and we could use. And so the kids were like, well, let's put that in our garden. Let's grow that in our garden. And so then we started making connections with some people who were growing their kalo locally. The kids had to learn the process for replanting it. We had to learn the process of what do you do when your kalo gets taken over by fire ants. You know, really experiential learning that, you know, my hands were not too happy about pulling that out and getting the fire ants everywhere. But, you know, that experiential learning all the same. And what I hope, and based on my conversations with my students who are now in 6th grade at our school, that I really feel that they've started to see themselves as the experts in the learning, that they have valuable knowledge that can be shared, things that make them not only connected to the place that they're in, but connected to the people in the community around them. They are important people in our community. They have an important role now and in our future. And so, yeah, what it really comes down to, I think, and having the opportunity to learn from awesome teachers like Whitney and speakers and authors, is that, you know, most of the time, the best learning happens when I get out of the way and let them have those conversations and let them explore and tackle these issues, which can be really tough at sometimes. You know, when we believe in our kids, they can do so much. They can hit these hard issues. They can go after the things that are impacting Hawaii today and in the future. They can learn from the things that have happened in the past, and they can do that through discussion and conversation and learning with each other. And I'm just there to facilitate and support and encourage them to be their best.
You know, I love the way all of you, every single one of you, in your approach to teaching, really understand that it's about encouraging that voice in young people, in students, and getting them to trust themselves and to have confidence in their ability to think, to conceptualize, to share, to stand up for things, and that, you know, because I know how Patricia teaches, and what both of you have spoken about here, that really changing the lens through which we see education, from something that is coming from outside of them, and even from a very, very foreign place, to something that really emerges from them and comes back to you. I have to tell you that as an elementary student, and even as a middle school student in the 1950s and 1960s, I don't think I ever said anything in a class. I don't believe we were ever really encouraged to have an opinion. And that was already changing by the mid to late 1960s, and it's a good thing that it changed. But I can also tell you that every single textbook that I ever saw, from grades, you know, kindergarten through 11, were all designed and written somewhere else, very far from here, and we're taught that way. So I'm going to turn our attention now to Liz, and ask the same question. Who are you, Liz? And I want you to talk about poetry. I know that this is what you came prepared to talk about. The fact that that was not, by the way, really any kind of curriculum in K through 6 for me. It did start to become a part of the curriculum at Kamehameha in the 1960s, but it was classical poetry. We were written,
Wordsworth.
Yes, Wordsworth and Coleridge and romantic poets, and sometimes an occasional American poet. Nothing modern, of course, nothing in the 20th century. And this is one of the things I think you can speak to, but also, that student, that youthful voice, sense of confidence. Why do you think, maybe that's the question, why do you think poetry is the thing that seems to be able to engender that inspire people, both to write it, to speak it, to present it?
I feel like there's a multi-tiered, multi-part question in there. So did you want me to start with who I am?
Yes, I do.
So yes, I'm Liz Soto. So my family is actually settler in multiple places, both on Turtle Island and in the ʻāina in Hawaii. My family comes from the Visayas, Ilocos Norte, Guangdong, Germany, France, Texas, and Alabama. So, those experiences are inevitably part of, the stories that I'm thinking about and the stories that I'm telling and the stories that I look for. And I also want to say that I'm really honored to be among all these educators who are doing such amazing work expanding and nurturing our curriculum here in Hawaii, where, as John mentioned, stuff that he wasn't getting in the 1950s and 60s, that I can actually fairly say I wasn't getting in the 70s and 80s in Hawaii either. And when I say that, so I went to elementary school and middle school on Maui at that point, pretty much all the schools were in Wailuku or Kahului. And then I finished off high school on Oahu. So that, I'm bringing that background in. I was also in construction for like 15 years. That's a weird side thing. But let's see. As a poet, and one of the things that it's like, Topher actually made me think of this, in terms of like these youth-led conversations, where one of the organizations that I worked with was Youth Speaks Hawaii. And the parent organization Youth Speaks, which is out of the Bay Area, their motto is because the next generation can speak for itself. And the whole slant of the organization and everything we did with Youth Speaks Hawaii was that we basically ran workshops in schools, in communities that were open to youth between the ages of 12 and 19. I have to say that if somebody who was 9 turned up, they weren't turned away, but it did mean that we had to tell like all the 19-year-olds, okay, there's certain things that you can't talk about right now, that type of thing. And the main genre that we were teaching was slam poetry, which is competitive spoken word. So that was extremely popular. And it was one of those avenues where all these young people really got to offer testimony to their peers, to other audiences. To give you a kind of scope, at the time that a lot of this was happening, because I have to admit that it's kind of waned a bit in more recent years, at least on Oahu, these young people were performing in front of audiences that were, between 500 to 700 people. And it had huge impact in terms of both in Hawaii and the Pacific. And a lot of it was the youth being able to speak their own story. And we had an opportunity to compete nationally on the continent. And it was one of those things where even, thinking about what stories that we have to share and what stories we have to tell, we did find that every year we had to do Hawaii 101. which is kind of frustrating to some extent, right? But every time we went to the continent, we had to explain where Hawaii is. Like, a lot of people would think we're off the coast of California, like, why is there not a road? You know, we would actually get those kinds of questions. And a lot of people would have no idea that there's an indigenous community, that it's vibrant, you know, any of those things. People had very, very odd notions about Hawaii. So we knew we just kind of had to come with that. So I think, to step back a little bit, one of the things that I also want to mention is just like thinking about, so I'm looking at poetry both as how to teach youth to do poetry, but also how to teach poetry, you know, and that one of my things that I maintain is that poetry is inherently interdisciplinary, that it has the capacity to be taught and utilized at every level in every area of education. And Western education, you know, and John actually mentioned like the classic poems, you know, or classic poetry that we're often taught. And I'm going to say classic with the air quotes. You know, and there's some Pacific poets like Sia Figel who talks about Wordsworth and the daffodils. And one of the things that she talks about is how, you know, the daffodils it doesn't mean anything to me. I have no idea what daffodil is. Konai Thaman, a Tongan poet, she wrote this beautiful essay about how when she actually got a chance to, you know, she grew up in Tonga, she had never seen a daffodil, she was forced to memorize this poem, it meant nothing to her. She had this opportunity to go to England and she saw this field of daffodils and she was able to quote this poem and she was like, now it makes sense. But then she comes home and she writes this poem about Halela, which is a Tongan flower. And all of a sudden she had all these youth that, you know, she was teaching who actually could relate to it because they're like, oh, I know that flower. I know why this is special. I know why this means something, right? And to kind of slide into some of what you were talking about, John, it's like one of the things that I think poetry can do is it can bring that heart. Like it's the pathos, right? It's the emotion that you can completely play into and make a part of your argument in a way that we don't necessarily have access to in other modes of communication. So, and you know, again, I think like Western education is kind of sold us as poetry as being this like event of inaccessibility. You know, it's hard to understand, it's complicated, it's meant to be read silently. I will say that like looking at a lot of the curriculum that has been developed next to Value of Hawaiʻi 3, it's really clear that a lot of people are using poetry as, you know, like in these really exciting ways. So I want to applaud that. And it's like super exciting. But when I stopped teaching at UH in 2019, I was still getting students from Hawaii who had never read a poem in their life, which, you know, does suggest that it's still actually, they're not being taught. It's not being taught in the classroom. And I think that's also connected to that very Western concept that art is superfluous and unnecessary. But in a Pacific context, poetry and art are deeply woven into learning, into understanding and healing. And I actually just want to offer two quotes here from Value of Hawaiʻi, Hulihia. One is from Mary Therese Perez Hattori, and it's from her essay, We Are Art. And she says, the customs of Chamorro people who, like other Pacific Islanders, do not view art as distinct from cultural expression. Creative cultural practices are embedded within communities reflecting collective identities and values. So art is, you know, is at every level of your experience. And then another quote that I'd like to share is by Kainani Haunaele from The Value of Mele, where she says, Mele, Hawaiian songs and chants are our primary sources, literature and vehicles to celebrate, revere, grieve, recount, love, and request. The carefully woven lyrics are primary, holding Hawaiian language knowledge and worldview, pearls of wisdom from our ancestors, and experiences of the haku mele or composer. You know, so, you know, again, like just these quotes illustrate how interwoven in the Pacific context and the Hawaii context poetry has been, both in terms of Olelo Hawaii, but also in English, like some of the huge movements that happened in the 1970s and 1980s, where all of a sudden there was this explosion of literature, right? That a lot of us have actually forgotten about. And it's, I've had a number of students who I remember saying, like, they'd never seen these books by, Eric Chalk or John Dominus Holt, or, just like not recognizing that there's this rich literature that we have that tells the stories of who we are and who we could be and where we're going and where we've been, all these things. I'm going to stop now.
That was abrupt.
I'm just conscious of time. Sorry. Embedded in Slam, like you have like 3 minutes and 9 seconds, and then you go into penalty. So
listen, I've been just really enamored by the conversation tonight, and particularly because it focuses so clearly, right, on our clients, on our students, on the young people we work with, and so because we started by talking about Value of Hawaiʻi, and I want to point to the theme of this book, Hulihia, which is not just transformation, it's upheaval, really. That's what that word really means. It's a violent word in some ways. It's a traumatic kind of thing, certainly. And when we chose to bring the authors together, we were looking at least three, and the three main kinds of traumas that we were experiencing in 2020 and 2021, which was COVID, climate change, and this bizarre thing that seemed to be happening, that seemed to be tearing America apart. These the political conflicts that had become ugly and demeaning and disturbing, right? All of these things, you guys, and so I'm starting this conversation. I'm not going to pick on any one of you, but I hope you will all contribute to this conversation. These kinds of traumatic events are not things that started in Hawaii. They don't come from us. They're global, and they impinge on us. And yet, we seem to be digging in to our own traditions, our own past, our own place as a way of coping, right? Of living through this upheaval, of moving into a future that is strong, that is healthy. So I'm pointing that out and asking any of you guys to comment on that. And don't wait too long, or I'll start naming names. Cheryl. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Somehow I knew that. Two things come to mind. One is the remembrance of those kipuka in the state of destruction, the places that still hold our native seeds, our knowledge, our ability to grow and be inspired by. And I think that in these moments, we've been able to find those. So not just coming from a place of scarcity and deficit, but those places of strength and inspiration and hope. I think the second is agency, right? And that what this is, these moments of transition allow us to do is to deepen our commitment, our toes into the earth, and remain maybe for the first time, or maybe to be steadfast in the work of the kuleana that we hold, and so that we actually can do that. We are doing it. We have multiple examples of places where we are food secure, right? Places where the degradation and the trauma that ʻāina has experienced is being regenerated again, and where are not just restoring, but what we like to talk about is restoring, right? We're bringing those other narratives, the ones that sometimes get left behind or not lifted up, and we're allowed to bring in stories of wholeness, of healing, of agency, of ceremony. And I feel like these are the things to be celebrated and that help us through any Hulihia moment, which ancestral we have lots of that in our history. And so we have lots of resilience in our DNA. That's what comes to mind.
We have a lot of that Hulihia in our history, in our local, in this history of Hawaii. I'm going to turn to you in a moment, Topher, to kind of go a little further with this idea of this rootedness, because you are literally doing that with your students when you bring them outside, when you plant that garden, when you go through all of those exercises of seeing where food comes from. What are the problems that happen when you plant something? How do you deal with those? And I want to come to that conversation, but before I do, Whitney, in your description of how you transform your classroom, and this is true for Patricia as well, you really deal with difficult sorts of ideas about privilege, about that racist history that your parents were subject to, that my parents and grandparents, that I was subject to, the kinds of ways in which we as people were exploited and shoved into a system, and you're really basically, trying to get students to fight against that. And what's interesting about that is that from the perspective of many people in America, that is the reason why there is so much upheaval, right? This progressive kind of education that we have now brought even into fifth graders, right? The ways in which gender and sexuality and religious belief and values and multiculturalism, that is actually something that is seen as the threat that is causing, right, this instability. Tell me what you think about that, and then I'm going to come back to Topher.
Oh, all right. Thanks, John. That's a lot, but we definitely we tackle that every single day. I think one of my students often quote me as my most said thing is, "Your privilege is showing," and that's because we know that we are in a safe and brave space in order to express ourselves, honor our identities, and also problematize our identities. I do this with them. I model that with them. First, I have them read things that I've written, and then recognize that stories are what makes up our curriculum. So I don't know how it came about, but I think it was through COVID, and especially through the Value of Hawaiʻi, reading these things and like thinking that everybody's story has such value, because that's how we shape emotion and that's how we shape everyone's mind. I teach in the Public Services Academy. So I teach our students who want to become politicians, who want to become psychologists, who want to become teachers and lawyers. And how do we push people, and also natural resource practitioners, how do we push people to change? Well, we share our stories with them. Whether it's to create a new signpost at a beach because of a very dangerous surf break, or it's to have people stop throwing their trash on our campus, or anything like that. It's like sharing stories and making people feel some kind of emotion. Something that Tai Tengan, my dissertation committee member, had said to me recently was like, "What's your metaphor? How are you going to describe to people what you are doing through metaphor?" And I said to him, like, "I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I don't have a metaphor." And we were talking about it in terms of how do I do a methodology. And he kept saying, like, like Mehana Vaughn, she makes a lei, or like Jamaica has the upena, and like everybody has a metaphor. And I said, Ty, I don't make anything. He's like, you don't make anything with your kids? And I'm like, do I? And it's like, but we do. We talk and we make stories and we talk about these things, but like, what is the metaphor to that? And sometimes, yes, and I will be very honest right now that the metaphor that I have come up with for what I do in my classroom, how I consider a shared space in a building of community, I went back to a metaphor in indigenous Japanese culture. I went back to this idea of machizukuri and how we can take a urban planning design from Japan that's not anything to do with the Western knowledge, but create a metaphor out of it and bring it to my students saying, this is my culture. This is what I understand it to be. This is what we can do together, and have them then think of metaphors in their own culture. So these are plenty conversations that we have. And quite honestly, I think, like Topher said, the best thing is that students are making meaning with each other. And sometimes I can be so privileged to sit there and make meaning with them. And that's what we do, regardless of science. Science has quite honestly been so sterile. Western science is so sterile to these stories. But when you tell kids that Rosalind Franklin lived and died by her DNA X-ray machines, that makes meaning for them come alive for DNA. These stories that are not told enough because white men decided to not tell them, it's enough. We're done with it. And we just say, you know what, we're just going to tell the stories and we're going to make meaning together.
Thank you very, very much. Topher, I'm going to come back to because that's where that conversation was going at that moment. This notion of really rooting ourselves, and which I think you do literally here. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways in which you know that that's actually working with your fifth graders, the signs you get from them that this is working, that this is making that kind of difference?
Yeah, so I think I've got something that fits really well there. So like I said, I was very lucky that as part of my experiences and the people that I met and worked with, I got to see and learn from many different folks. And actually a group I got to learn from was the Kohala Center. And through working through them, we're piloting a toolkit for kilo observation. So going out, looking in our community, seeing what do we observe, what can we sense, and then taking that and making meaning of ourselves. And one of the things we talked about was the concept of the vahipana, a place that is important to you. And like many things in my life, I didn't understand it the first time. And for a while after that, I initially had the idea that a vahipana was, like simply limited to an important place in your family's history, or an important place where maybe a family member was buried. So when I brought that up with students and asked them to think about what their vahipana was, those were the kind of examples I would lead to. Maybe a vahipana is a heiau that's very important to you. Maybe it's a grave site, or possibly like a temple, or a lot of these like very, I guess, structural ideas. And kind of going back to what Whitney said, these things that are just like, it has to fit into one of these categories. And it was a student, and I've told this story a few times, and she knows that I tell this story. She said, well, Mr. Pike, my vahipana is a tree. It's a tree in my backyard. And I like to go sit under it sometimes when, maybe I'm having a bad day, or I'm not feeling really, not feeling great about myself. Or, sometimes when I'm having a good day, and, I'll sit there, I'll read a book, I'll throw rocks around, my dog will come up and he'll sit on my lap. And, it's not like, it's not anything special. She said that it's not anything special, but it's special to me. It's important to me. And that was a moment that hit me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go home. You get to go teach the class the rest of the time because you get it. You've taught me, you know, more than I could ever teach you. So in that sense, you know, like those are the moments that kind of stick with you, and you go like, yeah, like these kids get it. They get it way more than we could ever realize. And so I take those moments and, you know, hopefully share them and use them in my own practice to just be like, you know, there is so much that we can learn from the kids just by introducing the basic ideas of these concepts and letting them run with it, letting them see what happens. And I think the other thing to include there is modeling and recognizing mistakes, misconceptions, ideas that, you know, may change, that you can change your mind, that you can make mistakes and that's okay. You can learn different perspectives. Your ideas can change as things go on. That's an important concept in science. That's an important concept in everything. But yeah, it definitely, it made me think about Vahipana way different than my original mindset was set on. And just really, I think, opened doors for a lot of the students in class too, because then they started sharing out more ideas of like, oh, well, I have a few Vahipana. It's like, okay, that's great. We want you to share out what is an important space to you. Yeah, those are the kind of moments where it kind of hits you a bit and you're like, yeah, these kids are smart. These kids got it.
I'm being attentive to our time here, and I do want to have everyone have a chance to speak again, but I also want to bring Liz and Patricia back into this conversation. This notion of really seeing the students as seeing children, not just students, but children as partners, right, in the educational process, is so radically different from anything that I was taught as a child, and yet we've all seemed to have come to this place that we understand that this really is the future. This is the way we manage things. Patricia, and then I'll end up with Liz. Patricia, this sense of getting adults, because I've seen you do this with adults, getting adults to understand, right, that their perspective, where they stand, all those things, including their privilege, but also, you know, where their perspective comes from, why they might think, for instance, that gender is so important in their lives, right? Why it determines these things. You've gone through those kinds of exercises, I think, with younger students and older students as well. Can you talk a little bit about whether you see a real transforming taking place among the adult population and the middle-aged population, in terms of people seeing themselves as different than our parents saw themselves or our grandparents did, of seeing themselves in terms of agency, in terms of having a voice, and in terms of maybe even being able to understand other people who are not like them, who have different values, who have different practices and rituals. Do you see that happening? Do you see that happening?
So, John, I actually wanted to continue the conversation of Christopher and Whitney, more of like the student piece, actually, because while I work with adults and I work with teachers, I'm right now entrenched with working with students right now, middle and high school students who didn't feel like they had a voice in education. and you went back, I'm going back to your question about how important we're digging into who we are in Hawaii, and the voice of the next generation. And many might not know that Filipinos and Hawaiians make up almost half the DOE population. And I've worked with a group of high school students actually that have felt very invisible in their education. And so what I've done with them, with a group of high school students that have banded together from across Hawaii, they formed what we call a project called the Filipino Curriculum Project. And I'm working with them right now, actually, and using what I do with teachers to empower them on how to develop curriculum. So I'm actually teaching the stuff that I teach to teachers to high school students. And they have now developed curriculum around Filipino history, culture, and identity, and have even gotten the support of the legislatures as a resolution to support the work that they're doing. And so now they're creating a course, a social studies course on Filipino history, culture, and identity. And now I'm working with teachers, because we're all stepping in now as teachers to help with all the standard stuff, all the other stuff that maybe they don't need to deal with, like the bureaucracy. But the Department of Ed has been very supportive of this. And I'm sharing this story because even teachers are finally kind of seeing, and I think for many Filipino teachers, feeling and hearing, finding their voice as teachers, to include their stories as teachers in the classroom. And I know for myself, even as a professor, sometimes even though the work I do is around multicultural education, sometimes I wouldn't. It was interesting because I reflect back on when I bring my teaching in, I wouldn't necessarily focus on myself sometimes, because I would feel like maybe that was too much identity or who I am. But I've learned that we have to share our stories, right, in order for others to share their own in the work that we do. And now, working with teachers and Filipino students to design this curriculum is the kind of voice that I think Christopher and Whitney are talking about in terms of really empowering our students. And I really just get out of the way now at this point, give them the skills, the tools, the perspective, and then they're the ones that are designing the kind of curriculum that they want to learn in schools. I didn't really answer your question, John, but,
No, but
I was enamored by what Whitney and
good
Christopher
reason.
were saying.
Yeah, for a good reason. And we then can really finish this evening by talking about young people, and they really are, it's trite and not always true that young people are the future. Sometimes the future is in the presence of some middle-aged person who's just had enough, right? And is speaking out but it's also true that we have all invested so much of our lives in looking at those younger people and wishing and hoping that their progress in life, will be meaningful. Will bring them to the point where they can appreciate each other. That we can lessen the conflicts between people that happen, through xenophobia or just a general ignorance of other people's ways and rituals. And it seems to me, Liz, that you're a good person to kind of finish this conversation and talk about how that is enshrined in something like the creation of poetry and the sharing of poetry with others. What is it? If you could look at poetry and look at the way you've been able to inspire young people to employ that creativity to deal with their issues, some of which were dark and difficult, and to understand the world around them better. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, before I do that, I do want to just shout out to Patricia for that. Because I have to say, growing up as Filipino in Hawaii, you know, I was taught to be ashamed of that in the educational system. So it's just really, really cool what you guys are doing, and it warms my heart. I think it's funny. I think what's really, really important in terms of thinking about poetry is that it's not like this, like, you know, weird artifact or object by itself that's automatically going to do magic. That one of the things that, in my experience of teaching poetry, that's been so necessary and valuable is that it's been tied to extended long-term commitment and relationships to students. Most of the students that I've worked with, you know, that I started working with them, you know, between the ages of like 12 and 16, and I still know them. You know, and some of them have gone on to do really, really amazing work. Like Kathy Gentle-Kitchener, who's in Value of Hawaiʻi 3, Hulihia is one of them, and she's just doing astonishing work with her poetry, as is Jamaica Osorio. And I think part of it is approaching teaching as a conversation. You know, when we were, some of the best work that we did in terms of building poems was that I might come to the table with some ideas, but there was an expectation that the kids would be coming to the table with ideas as well, right? And it just became this like long-term conversation about this is what we need to do. This is what's important to me. And I frequently say that, you know, so this metaphoric table that I'm thinking of, and I want to think of the metaphoric table as maybe an essay that I could get really interested in a subject that, you know, and that'll bring me to the table. I could get really interested in something that's happening, but what's going to keep me at that table are people and love. That's one of the things that's going to make me stay part of the conversation. And I think that the building of poetry is so closely tied to creating love and creating, you know, even when you're talking about really difficult things, it's about creating relationships, creating love, creating these long-term sustained conversations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And actually, it's a good way of ending. I'm aware of the fact that we're right up at 7:30 and it's time to do mahalos. But before I do, I want to tell you that is something that you have all actually talked about without actually using the word love. You know, whether it's that community in Honau now that extended love to you, Whitney, your love for your ancestors and their history and their place in Hilo. And this, of course, goes to all of you. I mean, this whole conversation has been loving, and I have to say that that's a really good way to end this week, and this celebration of History Month. So I'm going to ask that we put the credits up. I'm going to express my appreciation for Liz, for Whitney, for Topher, for Patricia, and Cheryl for participating in this. And I'm also going to say mahalo to our financial, I think these are the financial sponsors, Kamehameha Schools, Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, Papaola Lokahi, John A. Burns School of Medicine, Department of Native Hawaiian Health, Hui o na Kauka, Center for Biographical Research, Waiakea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, Department of Theater and Dance at UH Manoa, Hawaii Youth Opera Chorus, Olelo Community Media, and OEV TV. Thank you very much for your support. And also here's a mahalo nui to all of our partners. You can read these here from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs down to Pa'i Foundation. It has been a really wonderful evening spent with these wonderful people. We hope that we have provided you with an interesting and inspiring conversation this evening. And aloha aiahi.